Hello, 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 hello. I am looking at some very brilliant, handsome, beautiful people. You're brilliant because you are here. You are smart enough to know that Rick Doblin is in the house. Now, you know Rick as the founder of M.A.P.S. How many people here knows a little bit about M.A.P.S? How many people here love M.A.P.S? How many people adore M.A.P.S? Zendo. How many people know about Zendo? And he'll talk a little bit about that too. But most of all, you today are going to get a ton of good news. And how many people here need good news? In fact, you're going to come out with a couple specific facts that I want you to spread around because this is such good news that we need to spread it. Now, Rick, besides creating M.A.P.S, before that, he got this doctoral degree from this community college in Cambridge, Massachusetts. You know, whatever. But most of all, we know Rick for what he has done, what he has created. And not only with MDMA, not only with LSD, not only with mushrooms, but more. And most of all, we now have him.
Thank you, Dana, very much. And thank you all for coming here to hear and to talk with us together. So to start on the theme of good news, I want to share some of the things that have really surprised me. And so on October 8th, which is a Monday coming up, one of the veterans that was in our study, one of the therapists and myself are giving a talk at a conference. And this is a conference that we didn't anticipate being accepted to speak at, but we applied in order to develop this outreach, this mainstreaming. But to our surprise, we were accepted. So on October 8th, we're giving a talk at the annual conference of the International Association of Chiefs of Police. And it's going to be about MDMA for first responders. And so we have done a lot of work with veterans. In our study that we did just with veterans, for political reasons, these are part of our phase 2 pilot studies. We decided just to name the study Veterans, Firefighters, and Police Officers, so we could kind of communicate that what we're doing is not just for veterans, it's not just for people that we might be sympathetic to, that it's for first responders, it's for firefighters and police officers. And we didn't actually anticipate getting any firefighters or police officers, but we actually got 22 veterans, 3 firefighters, and 1 police officer. So this idea of reaching out to the other is really being quite successful. And so we recently were at the American Psychological Association annual conference in San Francisco. And we had a booth in the exhibit hall, and across the walkway from us was the psychologist from the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And I was looking at them, and I was thinking, gosh, as long as we're right across the hall, I'm going to go talk to them about psychedelics for prisoners. And so we had this discussion about the Concord Prison Experiment, which was done with prisoners. It was Timothy Leary's main project, one of his main projects at Harvard, with Ralph Metzner, and it was about giving psilocybin to prisoners before they got released and trying to reduce recidivism. And so I mentioned this study to these psychologists for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and they were very interested. But then they said, don't forget the prison guards, that they have trauma as well. So when they said that, it was just this, again, one more sense of breaking these barriers between the us and the them, between the police authorities that have been oppressing people, that have been scaring me. I mean, I'm so used to running from the police to speak at a police conference. It's going to be very healing for me. We just, December 19th, we had a meeting with the DEA at the DEA headquarters, and we have a senior retired DEA official acting as a consultant for us. And as it turned out, he was in charge of the Arizona-New Mexico border in Mexico. So he had big responsibilities for the DEA. He knows all sorts of people in Washington. But the reason that he got involved with us is that his son enlisted in the Army. And his son has PTSD and is using marijuana for PTSD. So I think we can look very carefully around in our society and think that a lot of these people that are suffering, that we might think are trying to block what we're trying to do, if we really look deep into their suffering, a lot of them are really wanting us to succeed. They want to see about new healing therapies for their family, for themselves, and for others. So we have this cultural opening that we haven't had ever before. So in the 1960s and in the 50s, when there was all sorts of research with LSD and psilocybin, nothing ever reached what's called phase 3, which is the final stage of research you need to do before you can get permission to market a drug. And so we are now, in the next few weeks, about to begin phase 3 for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. We just, in a short few hours, encapsulated 9,200 capsules of pure MDMA. I used to spend weeks actually capping MDMA back in the olden days, and it took a long time. And so now we've got this pharmaceutical machinery for mass producing MDMA capsules in the final dosage form. So we've spent now about $1.5 million on getting what's called medical grade MDMA, which we have manufactured in England, and then we ship it to Pennsylvania, and that's where they put it into capsules. So we are really on the verge of starting, and I'll tell you a bit about how we got here, and then I'll talk about where we're going to go, and then I'll talk about some of the ethical challenges that we're dealing with, and then we can open it up for discussions, because I think this theme about ethical challenges and how we're going to try to move forward, and that's more of the crucial issues that we're trying to deal with now. So what I wanted to share first off is that I spoke earlier today at Burners Without Borders, and after my talk I was approached by this really big, strong, older guy, and he just started crying and started talking about how he was a veteran and he was ready to give up, and that he had tried all sorts of medications and tried all sorts of therapies, and he said that he was at the end of his rope, and that he was so worried about taking his life or feeling completely hopeless, and he was saying that he had heard about our work with MDMA, and he was wondering about what opportunities there might be for him to get involved in the therapy. And so that was just really sad for me, but also inspiring to realize that there are so many suffering people who are not adequately treated by the currently available treatments and medicines, and that some of them would find their way here to Burning Man and then find their way to my talk in order to just say, you know, what can be done? What do you have to offer to help? And so we actually do have, finally, opportunities to help. Right now, there's roughly 1 million veterans in America that are on disability payments for PTSD. It means they are not fully able to function, and they're receiving disability payments from the Veterans Administration. The last time the VA put out a number of how much they pay for disability, it was $20,000 average per year for people on disability for PTSD. And so what that means is that if we use the 2004 numbers, there's roughly $20 billion a year that the Veteran Administration is paying to veterans who are incapacitated to some degree by emotional problems from war. And when we think about the costs of war, we don't really think about the human cost as much in terms of the suffering from our own military. And these are mostly young people, and these costs are going to go on for 30, 40, 50 years. There's also roughly 600,000 veterans who are also receiving disability payments for other mental health related disorders, for anxiety, depression, and other things. So that when you add that up, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of $32 billion that the VA is putting out every single year. Now, we have been unable to get a single penny from the Veterans Administration to support research with MDMA. They're worried about the politics of it, they're worried about criticism from members of Congress, and yet they understand that they, meaning the leadership of the VA, the leadership of the Department of Defense, they understand that there are large numbers of people that are not adequately treated by the currently available medications, and they want to see what they could do without their incurring political risk or helping. So in a direct way. So that's been extremely frustrating. We've started since 1990 to reach out to the VA. And we had teams inside ready to do work. This was initially for Vietnam vets. And it would go up to the level of the political people who were in charge of this was the San Francisco VA, and they would squash it. And then every few years we would go back to a different VA with different teams of psychiatrists and therapists, and it would always get squashed at the political level. Until a few years ago, I was approached by Richard Rockefeller, and he was the son of David Rockefeller. He was from the Rockefeller family, and he realized that he couldn't just sort of coast on the wealth of his family. That wouldn't be good psychologically for him, and that he had to find something that was his own. And so he became a doctor, and then he became the chairman of the board of advisors of Doctors Without Borders. And from that, he worked in Europe with Kosovo and Serbia, and there he found, hundreds of thousands, millions of refugees. And these were all people that had been driven out of their homes, that were traumatized. And he was worried, what is there that's available to help all these people? There's not enough psychiatrists, there's not enough therapists. How can all of these people be helped? And he started thinking about MDMA. And so then he approached us, and we talked about he wondered what was the most difficult thing that we were doing. What was our biggest challenge? And I said it was our relationship to the Veterans Administration. Conveniently, his cousin was Senator Jay Rockefeller on the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. So the two of them started working with us to help us engage the VA and the Department of Defense in a dialogue about MDMA. And what ended up was a multi-year process of negotiations that ended up with a decision. We had a meeting with the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs, his team, the Secretary of the VA, the National Center for PTSD, a part of the VA, with people from all these groups. And the decision was made that they did not want us to start with active duty soldiers. What we were saying is that the sooner you can work with somebody after the trauma, the better, rather than having it solidify into chronic severe treatment-resistant PTSD. But they were saying that working with active duty soldiers was worrisome in the sense that they're trying to create this idea in soldiers that they should only do the drugs that the military gives them. And a lot of these people are young, from a drug culture, more open-minded, and they were worried that if they were to permit research with MDMA, with active duty soldiers, that so many soldiers suffering from PTSD themselves would work to self-medicate. So they said, better just start with the veterans. And so we arranged to work with one of the leading therapists at the Veterans Administration who had developed what's called cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy. And so conjoint means couples or dyads. So it's a cognitive behavioral therapy, but it's where with a couple where one of them has PTSD and it affects the relationship. And so the other person is impacted, and then they bring both of the people into the treatment process. And what they were interested in doing was seeing how MDMA might blend with this essentially couples therapy approach for PTSD. And so they said that the researchers, though, had to work with us using their academic affiliation, not their VA affiliation, that we had to pay for the studies. So here we are giving tiny maps, giving grants to the Department of Defense and the VA, in a sense, and that the patients had to come from outside the VA. And that way they weren't directly involved. They couldn't be criticized by members of Congress, but they were permitting their therapists to work with us. And they'd heard so much about love drug, hug drug, they thought this couples therapy approach would be a good one to start with. And so we were able to work with Candace and Ann Wagner, her assistant, and we've completed now 6 couples, and this was called a treatment development study. And it's been phenomenal. This idea, we got permission from the FDA, the DEA, from the institutional review boards to give both members of the couple MDMA instead of just the person with PTSD. So this is the first time since Rick Strassman in 1990 got permission to work with DMT. It's the first time that more than one person has been dosed at one time. And of course now we're trying to move eventually towards trying to do group therapy as a way to see how we can be how we can take advantage of groups and also how we can reduce the cost of the therapy. But this treatment development study worked so well that these VA-affiliated therapists are really convinced that MDMA has tremendous potential. And it can blend with other therapies. We have our own method, which we now call inner-directed therapy. And so the concept of our treatment approach originated with Stan Grof and others in the 50s and 60s with LSD. And the basic idea is that there's this sense that we all know that our body is the self-healing mechanism. That if we get hurt, our body knows how to repair itself. We have to clean out the obstructions, we have to deal with infections, but our body has this move towards restoring the original order. And so there's this wisdom in ourselves, in our bodies, in our cells, to try to heal injuries. And the thought is that there's something similar in the psyche, which we have called the inner healing intelligence. And so that if you can take this as a metaphor, there's some sort of process in the psyche that is moving towards integrating split off parts, that's moving towards healing, and then there's all sorts of emotional blocks that are in the way. And what we know about psychedelics is that they bring things to the surface that have been suppressed or that have never been experienced, and that they can help people get out of patterns. But there's an order that things come up with, that come to consciousness that we don't really understand. And a lot of times things come through the body. So one of the doctors that we work with, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who's one of the experts in PTSD, he's written a very successful book called The Body Keeps the Score. And it's about how trauma is stored in the body. And so this inner healing intelligence will bring things up, sometimes initially in the body, sometimes ideas or feelings, and we encourage people to trust that process, to let things emerge. An example I'll give is that quite a few years ago, I was, when we were right before MDMA became illegal, and we were working with a bunch of different people, and I was sitting for a German psychiatrist. And while we were doing this MDMA session, his arm became paralyzed, and he was unable to move it. And so we knew that MDMA doesn't cause nerve damage. MDMA is not going to cause any kind of paralysis like that, that there was something psychosomatic going on. And so he was originally quite scared about what's going on with his arm, and was that going to have permanent damage, what was happening. And so we encouraged him to really think about it as a psychosomatic process. We weren't worried about his arm. And so what happened then over the next couple hours is he started telling the story about how because he was a doctor, his father at one point was on life support, and he had a meeting with his mother and the rest of the siblings, and they decided that their father would not want to be sustained by machines, and that they would sign an order to take him off all of these life support systems. And because he was the doctor, he had to sign this order. And so as he was explaining this, his arm is still paralyzed, and then he says, and the problem is I hated my father. And so he further elaborated that he was conflicted. Did he actually kill his father? Was this something that he acted out of hatred, or did he act out of love, or how was this actually, how did he interpret it, how did he understand it? And the more that he talked about it, then the more he started thinking that his mother was in favor of it, his father's wife, that his siblings were in favor of it, his father was really suffering, and that it really was a humanitarian thing to take him off of life support. And as he sorted it out, that he did really act from a position of love rather than hatred, the feeling started coming back to his arm. And by the end of the session, he was fully operational again. So this idea of this inner healing intelligence, conflicts come sometimes through the body, sometimes through ideas, and we don't know exactly why this order is. And so we talk about our therapeutic approach is to support people in whatever is emerging, and to do that in a way that helps them to experience things as fully as possible. One of the beautiful things that Stan Grof has talked about is about this emotional process of how you get healing. Because many of you may have been in psychedelic states, I've certainly been in them, where it seems like it's never going to end. It seems like you're stuck in these horrible spots, and it's never going to end, and how are you going to move forward? And so what Stan has described for those kind of moments, he said that the full experience of an emotion is the funeral pyre of that emotion. That the constant in life and the universe is change. And if you can fully experience something, even if it's grief or sadness or fear or anger or feeling of trapped, if you can fully experience something, then it will change, then it will grow, then something new is coming. So that's the essence of the therapeutic approach, that we have this faith that the order that things come in is unknown to our conscious mind, but it's something that we should honor and open up to, and that there's this therapeutic approach, this inner-directed therapy, which is focusing on the therapist not coming with an agenda, not doing, for example, guided imagery can be very, very effective in therapy, but we don't use guided imagery. We want the inner-directed, we want the person to be their own guide. We don't even use the word guide, because guide for the therapist implies that we know where people need to go. And we don't fundamentally believe that we know where people need to go or where the experience needs to go. And so we're working in that kind of a context, and what we're doing is trying to demonstrate both to treatment-resistant patients, but also to the whole field of psychiatry and psychology, and to the FDA, that this general approach has merit. So I said before that we operate a little bit on faith, but it's not so much faith. There's no proof of this kind of inner healing intelligence, but the faith is based on data. It's based on outcomes, and to see that this approach has produced incredible outcomes. So to give you an example of what we've learned in phase 2, we have 107 PTSD patients that we've treated in Israel, Switzerland, Canada, and the United States. And these range from women survivors of childhood sexual abuse and multiple abuse, so that would be called complex PTSD. We work with people who have just had a single attack of rape or assault or something like that. We work with people that have had workplace accidents, car accidents, operations, that they've got PTSD from medical problems, and we've worked with veterans with war-related PTSD, with firefighters, police officers, all different kinds of PTSD. And so what we've been able to show in this phase 2 process is that the therapy that we're working with works regardless of the cause of PTSD. So that was one of the most important findings that we were able to get in phase 2, because the SSRIs, the only drugs that are available by prescription for PTSD, work not that well. They have a small effect size, and they work more in women than in men, and they've failed in combat-related PTSD. So that was a big question for us. Would our therapy work with regardless of the cause of PTSD? And so it turns out that it does. We also demonstrated that we could work in a safe way. I mean, many of you may have heard that sometimes people take MDMA at raves and dance and overheat and die. And so that has happened. It's extremely rare, but it does happen. Sometimes people have heard about that and have heard about drinking water, and occasionally people have drank too much water and died from that, from hyponatremia. And so what we've been able to demonstrate is that those kind of risks are not from MDMA by themselves. They're from a combination of MDMA and the environment. And when we create a different kind of environment in a therapeutic setting, we don't see these problems. We don't see very much in the way of temperature rise. We don't give people water, actually. We give them electrolytes, fluid, fruit juices, things with electrolytes. We control their fluid intake. We do a lot of medical screening beforehand. The one thing MDMA will do is increase your blood pressure and your heartbeat, so we do screen for heart problems. We do work with people with controlled hypertension. We do them a stress test to make sure they can handle a little bit of exercise. But we've been able to demonstrate that in our setting, we can administer MDMA in a safe manner. Now, that's physically safe. There is some concern that people with PTSD have a high rate of suicide and suicide attempts. And so we have had no successful suicides. We track that very carefully. I just learned that we did have one person who attempted suicide between the second and third MDMA session. I'll explain a little bit more our therapy method later, but the point here is that this woman did this in a way that she would obviously be rescued. She wasn't really trying to kill herself. But it turned out that the reason was that she had had such a difficult life, and that in this therapeutic environment, it was so healing for her that she was starting to be worried about ending the therapy and it being back out on her own. So this was, in a way, a cry for help to continue the therapy, which we're not able to do, actually. We have a very time-limited, standardized therapy for everybody. Once the drug's approved as a medicine, then that can be different. Then people can have more sessions or fewer sessions. But we have this time-limited intervention. And so some people have never really been in a loving, therapeutic, healing environment. And once you're in something like that and you feel how nurturing it can be very terrifying to think about how that might end and people being off on their own. So, that's the big concern that we have about moving to phase 3 will be, will we have any of these really serious emotional reactions? We would, according to the FDA, that we would be able to survive that even if more than one person commits suicide in our study, because there was such a base rate of suicide in this group. FDA really does take a look at risk benefit, and so that gives us kind of hope if that happens. But of course, we're going to try very hard to make sure that doesn't happen. So we've been able to demonstrate safety, and we've been able to demonstrate it works regardless of the cause of PTSD, and we've been able to demonstrate something even more impressive, I think, which is that of the people that have been in our study, all have been treatment resistant, all have had chronic PTSD, and on average severe to extreme. What we showed is that 2 months after the last MDMA session, roughly 61% no longer have PTSD. So it's really incredible. So the 2-month follow-up after the last experimental session is what the FDA is going to look at, and European medicine agents also. They're going to compare the outcomes for our control group, which is going to be therapy with inactive placebo, and versus therapy with MDMA. That at the 2-month follow-up is what's called the primary outcome measure. But we also do a 12-month follow-up. And that's more for insurance companies. And that's to look at the durability of the effect and to try to demonstrate that the effects last, hopefully, for most people. And also we want to look at what's called healthcare utilization. We want to try to demonstrate that people who have, we already know that people who have PTSD go to the emergency room more often with panic attacks. They have more heart attacks. They have more physical problems, all sorts of problems that come from the stress of being constantly traumatized. And so we want to show that there's a reduction we want to show if there's a reduction in all these other healthcare aspects. And so we do a follow-up at 12 months. And what we found at 12 months is that people keep getting better. So at 12 months, 2/3 of the people no longer have PTSD. And of the 1/3 that still has PTSD, most of them have had a clinically significant reduction of symptoms, even though they still have PTSD. And so what we're finding is that we start this process, but then people continue it on their own. Once you've learned that these materials, these emotions that you thought were too powerful or too sad, that you might be trapped in them or that you can never get out of them, once you've learned a little bit how to process them, then that is something that you can continue to keep doing over and over on your own. So this catalyzes a self-healing process that continues beyond our therapy. So that's been really important. The other main thing that we learned, Dana introduced me by saying that I went to this community college in Boston. And one of the past presidents of this college had this great statement that I actually opened up one of our meetings with the FDA about it. And he said that never forget, there's always a Harvard man on the wrong side of every issue. And so my dissertation was about the regulation of the medical use of psychedelics and marijuana. And one of the biggest scientific challenges of doing this research is how did you fit within the model that the FDA has, which is a placebo-controlled double-blind study, randomized placebo-controlled double-blind study. And that's the method that is actually applied for every single drug to show that to really evaluate its safety and efficacy. But it's very difficult, virtually impossible, to do a double-blind study with psychedelics that's effectively double-blind for most people. So that if you've ever taken a psychedelic, you probably can tell it apart from nothing. Now, there are a few times when we have an ability to give MDMA to therapists as part of their training. And that was a tremendous sign from the FDA that they were willing to really work with us in a fully reasonable way. Because as we mainstream from various very committed original therapists, many of whom have a background in psychedelics and consciousness and change and meditation, as we try to move into a broader world of therapists, most of them have not done MDMA or psychedelics, and we feel that therapists are going to be more effective if they've done the drug themselves. It's not that every therapist who's done MDMA is better than every therapist who's not done MDMA, but it's just each therapist would be more effective than themselves if they had never done the drug. So we made a case to the FDA about that, and they agreed. And so we actually have a study where we can take people from all over the world to give them MDMA. And we've had this happen 2 times where psychiatrists, traditional psychiatrists who work with trauma, who have watched 6 days of videotapes of therapy sessions, who've talked about our manual, our treatment method, who've done a 12-hour online course, who've also come together for another week in person to learn about working with teams. We always work with a male-female, well, we work with a 2-person team, almost always male-female. Occasionally it could be 2 males or 2 females, but the idea is, at least for our phase 3, male-female co-therapy team, so that people have been through that, and then the next step is for them to take MDMA in a therapy setting, and then the final step is for them to work with 1 patient, open label, meaning no double blind, supervised by our training team, so that they have that experience with patients before they start working in phase 3. So we've had 2 times where, and one of these therapists is here camping with us. He's the chief psychiatrist for the Dutch Ministry of Defense. And he's one of the top experts in PTSD around the world. And so he's been working a lot with all the different approaches for therapy. And so on his first, so the way it goes is that we have a 4-day program. You come in, you get it's really 5-day. You come in, you get oriented. The next day you get It's an 8-hour session. You're either going to get MDMA or placebo, and with the two therapists there for you. Then there's a day of integration. Then there's a day where the crossover. If you whatever you got the first day, you get the opposite on the second day. So if you got MDMA the first day, you get the placebo. If you got the placebo, you get MDMA. So twice it's happened, once with this psychiatrist, once with another psychiatrist, that somehow they had this intuition that they were going to get MDMA the first time. And so while they were waiting for this MDMA to come on, they started feeling all sorts of physical things, and then they started processing really deep trauma from their childhood, and they started working through different issues, and they had these incredibly productive sessions that lasted pretty much 8 hours. And at the end of the session, we asked people to guess. Did you get MDMA? Did you get the placebo? We asked the patients. Often the patients, the therapists have a co-therapist there, so we train both at the same time. And then we ask our two male-female teams. So in this particular case, everybody was 100% convinced that this was MDMA. And then the next day there was more integration work, and it worked really, really well. And so then comes the third day, the crossover period, and everybody's thinking, this is going to be easy, this is going to be the placebo. And the psychiatrist described how after he took this pill, after about an hour, he said his jaw just dropped. And he couldn't talk for 4 more hours. And he had one of his big things that I came amazed at how what he had been able to do with his mind on the first day to convince everybody that it was MDMA. Once he actually had MDMA, everything was easier and deeper and more profound. So occasionally the placebo does work. And the only other time it worked like that in our therapy training program was another psychiatrist who also had never done MDMA before. So what I had, though, thought in my dissertation, and I was super proud that I had solved the double-blind problem. And I thought that the best way to address it is not with inactive placebo, not with amphetamines or another drug, because therapists would be able to tell it apart, the patients would have learned a lot about MDMA, they would probably be able to tell it apart. But I thought the solution would be low dose of MDMA versus full dose of MDMA. And the challenge was going to be finding the dose of MDMA that was high enough to produce enough experiences that it would be confused in a significant way with the full dose, but not so high that it really became very therapeutic, so that it would become almost impossible to tell the groups apart. So that was my solution to the double-blind problem. And my dissertation committee, including some experts in FDA drug development, all thought that's great, I had solved it. So then when we started doing the phase 2 studies, we've tested 25 milligrams, 30 milligrams, 40 milligrams, 75 milligrams, 100 milligrams, 125, and 150. And the way we administer these drugs, it's always it's 10 in the morning till 6 at night, 8-hour sessions, and there's a half at 1.5 to 2.5 hours after the initial administration. The therapist and the patient talk about it, and we administer a supplemental dose that's half the initial dose. And so what that does is it extends the plateau so that it's a very long session. Occasionally, if you administer it at 1.5 hours, it can make it a tiny bit stronger. If you wait till 2.5 hours, 2 hours, it just sort of extends this plateau. So that's our model. And so we are trying to figure out which is the dose that we want to do for the control group and which is the dose that we want to do for the experimental group. And so the way I opened up this meeting with the FDA was about how the Harvard man on the wrong side of this issue was me, that my whole theory was totally wrong, and it did not work. Now, this might not apply for psilocybin, but I'll say for low-dose MDMA, what we discovered that 25, 30, and 40 milligrams in PTSD patients makes them more anxious. It doesn't reduce the fear. It doesn't really help them process the emotions, and they've been struggling with emotions that they haven't been able to deal with for a very long time, and now they're in a situation where they're being asked to deal with it, and they actually don't like it, and they do worse than if they had had no MDMA at all. So we've done a series of studies where people get therapy without any MDMA at all versus therapy with low doses, and so it turns out that the low doses, people still get a little bit better from all this time and attention and therapy, but not as much as if they had no MDMA at all. So what that meant for the FDA was that they could choose blinding. We could produce more effective blinding by using low-dose MDMA, but it would make it easier for us to show a difference between the two groups than if we used no MDMA at all. And so we basically left it to the FDA and said there is no solution, and you can choose blinding or you can choose making it harder on us to show a difference between the two groups. And that's what we suggest. We suggest that it be, the real issue is if you can do stuff with therapy, why bother add a drug? So also we want to know what are the side effect profiles of people going through therapy with PTSD without a drug too. What is the baseline of side effects? So we learn that better if there's no drug as well. And so the FDA ended up agreeing that that's how we would do it, that we would work with therapy with inactive placebo versus therapy with our full dose MDMA. And then what we discovered to our surprise, I personally like 125 milligrams. I think that's really good. I don't really like 75 milligrams as a dose. It's kind of halfway there, halfway not, and you know, I'd rather do more. You know, as the saying goes, more is more. And so with our study with veterans, firefighters, and police officers, what we decided to do was to do 3 different doses, 30 milligrams, 75 milligrams, and 125. And that was going to be a way, at this point we thought maybe 75 would be a good control. We weren't sure. And so what happened in that study, which really surprised us, was that the 75 milligram dose group actually did better than even the 125. And now they were, the 125 group, by the way it works randomly, they were higher on depression, much higher on depression than the 75 milligrams group, so that maybe had somewhat of a blunting effect. So we can't say for sure 75 is better than 125, but it helped us to understand about the mechanism of action. And I'll explain a bit later how it modified what we're going to do in phase 3. But the mechanism of action, many of you may have heard that in the work in the 50s and 60s with LSD and psilocybin, and in the modern work with psilocybin for depression, for alcoholism, for nicotine addiction, for OCD, that there's a clear correlation. The most reliable finding is that the depth of the mystical experience is linked to the therapeutic outcome. The more somebody goes beyond the ego, has this unitive sort of sense of connection, the more that they can draw strength from that. People with addiction, people feared of death, are isolated. They don't have a lot of that sense of this sweep of history, this persistence, this transcendence of time and space, this tapping into the sort of essence of love. They don't have access to a lot of those things. And so, as it turns out, the depth of the mystical experience is correlated with therapeutic outcome for all of the classic psychedelics. And what we know about the classic psychedelics is that the part of the brain that's called the default mode network, which is essentially your resting state, where we have, it's equivalent to the ego in a sense. It's the closest we understand to the ego structures in the brain. And that's where we sort out all of our different needs, our needs for love, our needs for relationship, our needs for food, survival, work, community. You know, we're always trying to sort through what do we need to do. And this default mode network is kind of this ego structure that helps us figure out what to do next. But it also filters out an enormous amount of perceptions that we're getting. Subliminal perceptions, other things that we might be wanting to do, but we don't need to do it as much as something else. So this part of our brain, in a sense, acts as a reducing valve. And it only helps us focus on the core things that our sort of ego structure says we pay attention to. And so what psychedelics do is they actually weaken the default mode network. They weaken the filtering structures of the brain so we get more perceptions, a flood of perceptions, and then we can see how things are all connected. We move beyond this centered around our ego and have this sense about body sensations and just evolution, and I mean this idea of how colors and sounds can have synesthesia, all different things that lead to this mystical experience, and that's what works. And that's why a lot of these therapy settings with classic psychedelics are focused on two things. One is bringing up repressed material that people have not wanted to see, not wanted to talk about, and then encouraging people to have these mystical experiences to the extent that that's possible. And so we've looked at that. We use the same questionnaires for mystical experience in our MDMA experience research that's used in the psilocybin and LSD and ibogaine work. And so what we've discovered is that there is no correlation between therapeutic outcome and mystical experience with MDMA. And surprisingly, people, around 1/3 of the people in our study had a full mystical experience with MDMA, according to this questionnaire. The sense of love, the sense of feeling warm and connected, a sense of self-acceptance, deeply felt positive mood. A lot of the things sort of the MDMA experience map pretty well onto the mystical experience. But there is no correlation. And so what we know is that PTSD changes the brain. And the way it changes the brain, and this is regardless of the cause of PTSD, is that the amygdala, which is the fear processing part of the brain, becomes hyperactive. That you do studies about brain activity, and there's more activity in the amygdala in people with PTSD on average than not. And PTSD also limits activity in the frontal cortex, where we think rationally. So our ability to rationally say that noise is just a car backfire, it's not a bomb, or that person who's wearing clothes that was similar to the person that attacked me, that the ability to kind of differentiate that that's not happening, that the trauma is not happening again, that gets weaker. People's prefrontal cortex is reduced, they're more motivated emotionally, and it's a very difficult situation for people. And MDMA, in contrast, does the opposite. So if we were to design a drug to treat PTSD, it would be MDMA. MDMA reduces activity in the amygdala so that the fear tags related to memories of certain incidents or certain episodes in one's life, they're reduced so that we can look at the incident, the traumatic experience, in more detail. And people's memory is enhanced for the trauma. And a lot of times people have suppressed stuff that's particularly painful about their trauma that they don't even remember. So MDMA enhances memory, and then it increases activity in the frontal cortex. So we think more rationally about things, and then it increases activity between the hippocampus and the and the amygdala. And so what that means is that the hippocampus is where we help put memories into long-term storage. And so you could say, in a sense, that PTSD, people's traumatic memories are never fully processed. They're too painful. They're never fully processed. They're sort of stuck in this loop that never gets them into long-term memory. And under MDMA, with reduction of fear, with enhanced rationality, MDMA also stimulates the hormones of oxytocin and prolactin. And so nursing mothers have more oxytocin. You have more oxytocin, prolactin when you're in love. So these are the hormones of nurturing, of bonding, of connection, and they're increased. So people have the ability to establish a more trusting relationship with the therapist. They can accept their own feelings more. And so what seems to be happening with MDMA, with the therapeutic use of MDMA, is a process called fear extinction and memory reconsolidation. And so what happens is that you're able to look at this trauma or series of traumas. Usually most of us will be traumatized in our lives through something or other, either directly or indirectly. Just thinking about refugees, thinking about what's happening to the environment, thinking about just being empathic, that you get secondary PTSD. But a lot of us will have actual accidents or abuse or something that happens to us. And so roughly 90% of the people that have traumatic experiences do not get PTSD. There's a resilience and we can recover from it. But those people that get PTSD tended to have a series of traumatic events earlier in their life. And so you kind of go through them under MDMA therapy. But what happens is that when you are able to take a memory that's connected to fear, and the fear is reduced, and you're able to process it also into long-term memory, what happens is that memory, what we're learning, it's not like you take a book off a shelf and you read the book and then you put the book back on the shelf. It's more like you have to take the book off the shelf, you've got this memory, but then you have to reprint the book. You have to recreate this memory, and that's called memory reconsolidation. And so what's happening is kind of a switcheroo here, where you're switching the fear from that prior memory. Now you process the fear, you put it in the past, and the peacefulness that you have from MDMA, and that sense of self-acceptance, that's the memory that gets reconsolidated with that memory of the episode. So that then the next time you remember it, it's in the past. It's not in the present, and it's something that you can look at with a peaceful sense. And so that helps us to understand why 75 milligrams, which is this medium dose, it doesn't really produce a lot of the waves of body feelings that we like, a lot of the deep sense of just connected into the universe, but it does give people an ability to look at their trauma and to do this sort of fear extinction memory reconsolidation. Richard Rockefeller once told me about how he sat for a bunch of people, and during 3 different people, he said, while they were under the influence of MDMA, talked about their fear of flying. Richard was a pilot, and sadly that's actually how he died in a plane crash about a little bit more than 4 years ago. But he said that even when it wasn't the purpose of the therapy, these 3 people talking about their fear of flying under the influence of MDMA, at the end of it, they didn't think that much of it, but later all 3 of them were able to go on planes. That somehow or other that had extinguished that fear of flying for them. So what we believe is that this process of fear extinction, memory consolidation, it works really well. And so our treatment model that we're using is 3.5 months. And it's 12 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions. 3 before and there's 3 MDMA sessions, roughly 1 month apart. So a lot of people, when they hear about MDMA therapy, they kind of confuse it with traditional pharmacotherapy, and they think maybe you get MDMA every day, or maybe you get MDMA for 20 times or something. So our model is 3 times only, once a month, well, 3 to 5 weeks apart, for 3 times. So it's 3 90-minute sessions with both therapists as preparation before the first MDMA session. And then after the MDMA session, it's 8 hours from 10 in the morning till 6 at night. We have people spend the night in the treatment center. After the 2 therapists leave, a night attendant comes, who's not meant to really do therapy there, but just to be there, to take care of them, to bring them dinner. If they feel like the emotions are too strong, that they can't go to sleep, they can call the therapist. So people are never left alone. They spend the night in the therapy setting, which gives them a lot of opportunity to really relax, to rest, to not have to go home and then come back. And then the next day, they wake up, they're rested, the therapists come back, and they have at least 90 minutes more of integrative psychotherapy. Then they can't drive home. Somebody else has to come and take them home. Because we don't want people to have any responsibilities on the second day. We don't want them to have to drive. And we also say to them that while some people have learned for them that taking something like 5-HTP after MDMA can make it come down easier, that we don't do any of that. We're just trying to find out what MDMA does. We encourage them to rest the second day, and we find that that works terrifically. Then they go home, and then we call them every day for a week just to check in, just to see how they're doing. And then they come back for in-person psychotherapy. There's several more between the first and the MDMA and the second MDMA session, and then we repeat that 3 times. And then there's three integrative sessions after the last MDMA, and then we evaluate them 2 months and 12 years later. So that's our basic therapeutic approach. And so what we've decided to do is the first session is going to be 80 milligrams. The reason we changed from 75 milligrams to 120 and 125 is that it's extremely expensive to make the final dosage form in multiple different amounts. So we sat around and did some math, and we figured out that if we can use 80 milligrams and 120 as our main doses, we can do that with just capsules of 60 milligrams and 40 milligrams, and we could save several $100,000 by doing that. And we figured it's not that much different between 75 and 80 or between 120 and 125. So our first session that people are going to get is always going to be 80 milligrams or placebo. They're not going to know which, but they'll know it's either going to be 80 milligrams or placebo. And then 40 milligrams as a supplemental dose, which our approach is that we'll always be giving that unless there's some really good reason not to, which will rarely happen, but maybe that'll happen. People might feel they've had enough. And then the second MDMA session, we're switching to being 120 with a 60 milligram follow-up. And so again, the idea will be that that's going to be the standard unless there's some really good reason that people just thought that the 80 milligram was fantastic for them, but we'll assume that it'll go up to 120. And then the third MDMA session is, again, a discussion. Do they want to stay at the 120 or go back to 80? So there's flexibility that we're building in. Some people have talked about trying to do dosing on the basis of milligram per kilogram, on the dosing of body weight. But that's pseudoscience. That seems like scientific, milligrams per kilogram, it's super precise. But our first phase 1 dose response safety study that we did that way, milligrams per kilogram dosing, the subjective experience varied more widely than we did fixed dose. And when you think about it, it's like nobody doses LSD based on body weight, or psilocybin really. Sometimes that's being done, but psychiatric medications are not based on body weight. You get certain SSRIs, they adjust the dose. So we feel that this fixed dosing is the way to go. We'll start, now, we have this 3-session model, and that's what everybody's going to get, that 3-session model. And what we have found is that people that are high in dissociation, that's a really common strategy during trauma, is to dissociate and to not be there, in a sense, to withdraw, so that all this painful stuff, you're not suffering as much. But that gets to be a trap when you've removed yourself from your experience, and your experience seems really frightening, and so that can, in extremes, can lead to dissociative identity disorder, split personalities, just a certain emotional numbness. And so we find, though, that people high on the dissociation scale tend to need more sessions than people that are not high on that scale. So many people can really do a lot of progress in the first and second session. We're very much opposed to a 1-session model because we don't want people to think about this as a 1-dose miracle cure and now you're changed. There are people that have had 1 dose and have been cured. I'll tell you a story about one of those. There was a veteran that was in our study who had been debilitated for years by PTSD. And during everything else had failed, all the other medications and psychotherapies had failed, and sort of out of desperation, he volunteered for our study. And then in his first MDMA session, he started to realize that there was something that he was gaining from having PTSD, that there were advantages to being disabled with PTSD. And the advantage that he realized is that was an expression of loyalty to the friends of his that had been killed. And that as long as he was constantly thinking about it, that he was disabled by PTSD, he couldn't lead his life, that this was the expression of loyalty to his brothers in arms who had died or been terribly wounded. And that was the good part of it. And then, under MDMA, he was able to switch and see himself from the eyes of his friends who had died. And from that position, he was sort of getting into their minds, and he was realizing that they were thinking, if they could be alive to think, that they were thinking their lives had been lost, and they would not want him to throw away his life with PTSD as an expression of loyalty, and in fact that they would want him to live even more. They would want him to live for them because they couldn't do it. They would want him to live as much as he could, to be as happy as he could, to be as fulfilled as he could, not to be debilitated from PTSD. And so then he said, okay, he realized that, he said, okay, what am I going to do for the rest of my life? And in that moment, he was healed from PTSD. And then he said, yeah, it's astonishing. And then he said to himself, I'm on opiates for pain. and I'm somewhat addicted to opiates for pain, but I'm not really taking these opiates for pain. I'm taking them for escape. And he said, I don't need these opiates anymore. I'm not going to do them ever again. And then he said, I don't need drugs at all. I am cured. I don't need MDMA. I'm not even going to go to my second MDMA session. I'm done. And we said, it's super great you're done, but would you be willing to at least, you can drop out of the treatment, but at least do the outcome measures so we can see how you're doing. And he agreed to do that. And so at the 2-month follow-up, he did not have PTSD after just one session. And so then it's getting near the 12-month follow-up, and he's doing fine, but he's starting to think, maybe I could learn some more from MDMA. That was a good experience. Maybe I could learn some more. And we said, this is kind of difficult for us because you're outside the window of the protocol. We have a strict protocol. It's only for people with PTSD. So we said, we'll sort this out a little bit, but at the 12-month, go ahead and take the measure. It's called the CAPS, the Clinician-Administered PTSD Scale, and see if you still have PTSD. And as it turned out, he took the measure. He still did not have PTSD 12 months later. And that was about 7 years ago. And now he's volunteering in Cambodia to help other people less fortunate than him. So it's just a tremendous story of how one MDMA session can have these profound effects. But we don't really want to encourage this idea of one-dose miracle cure. And we also think that a lot of times people go deeper on the second session than on the first. So the first, they're building what's called a therapeutic alliance. They're getting to trust themselves. They're getting to trust the patient, the therapist. They're learning about the MDMA. They're learning that these therapists are there to help them, and they're building this alliance. And they get also like a tour of their traumatic histories. And so the second session is when they can go really deep, even deeper than the first session often. And we don't want them, now it's a multi-million-dollar decision on our part whether to go to a third session in our model or not. And what our sort of operating philosophy is that our goal is to maximize therapeutic outcome. We'll figure out how to make it more economical later, but now it's like, what's the best we can do to help the most people? And we've also realized that in the second session, when people are going really deep, a lot of times you might touch on something that feels so complex or so profound, you might feel, I cannot really resolve all of this in the second session. I might not want to open it up because I know this is my last chance. And so we find that the second session goes even better when there's a third session. That gives people, it's like a cleanup. Now in our Israeli study, we only did 2 sessions, and people did really well. So from an economical perspective, we probably could have done it with just 2 sessions. But we really find that people that are high on the dissociation scale, a lot of them need the third session. Some small fraction of them will need a 4th session, but we probably wouldn't do it right away. We would let them just sit with the 3 sessions for 6 months or a year and then come back again. But that's how we've arrived at our model. And so what we've been able to do is, over the last couple months, we've been able to raise $27 million for phase 3. All from donations. It really started about 6 years ago when Shauna Haley, who was a burner, he loved being here. I say he, but he's like a he plus, meaning transgender, but he never quite felt female, and so he was kind of like a he plus. He actually felt that he got too female at some point, and then took hormones to sort of bring him back. And then he realized he didn't want to be in any one particular place. He wanted to be going back and forth to see the world from different places. He was a brilliant person. The sad thing is he died at age 62 in his sleep, and he left us $5.5 million. And this was what we decided, that we would not spend it. We would save it for phase 3. The only thing that we did spend of that was around $400,000. That he was very interested in autism. And so we did a study with autistic adults with social anxiety, where we're trying to work on the social anxiety, not the autism, and we used a bit of his money for that. And that study was done by Charlie Grove and Alicia Danforth. They've been here and camped at this camp and have talked about it in the past, and they got really, really good results from that. But we were able to sort of show that there's multiple different applications for MDMA, but that was our first chunk of money we decided to save for phase 3. And then perhaps many of you have been over to the foam showers at the Foam Against the Machine camp. And so that's run by the Dr. Bronner Soap Company, and the senior Dr. Bronner was driven crazy by the Holocaust and came out of it with this philosophy that we're all one. So that's actually brilliant, and that's right, this idea that the sort of mystical sense, how we're all connected. But where he was driven crazy is he was obsessed with that and abandoned his children a bit. There was actually, he had a follower who crucified himself to sort of get this message across, and so there's multi-generational trauma. People who are traumatized can pass that on through epigenetics to their children, and so Dr. Bronner, the original, sort of passed some of that on to his kids, and he alienated them because he went on this mission. They were even in foster care sometimes, but then his grandkids have come along and are now sort of have the idealistic mission and the practicality, and so they've now built up the Dr. Bronners from about $2 million a year to $125 million a year in sales, and they give away 40% of their profits, and so they've donated $1 million a year for 5 years to M.A.P.S for phase 3. And actually, Richard Rockefeller he came with me to meet with David's brother and mother to explain to them that David wasn't nuts to be supporting psychedelics so much, and that ended up increasing their donations. And then we've received $2.5 million, a pledge of $2.5 million from one of the early Facebook pioneers. We've got $1 million from one of the early Twitter people. We've received multiple millions from FedEx Inheritance. And then what really happened is in October, I had a meeting with the Deputy Director of the National Institute of Mental Health, with senior people from the VA and the Department of Defense, and also the Wellcome Trust. And the Wellcome Trust is the largest charity in Europe, in England. It's got about $30 billion. And so it became clear in all of those meetings that they all were interested in what we were doing, but none of them would fund phase 3. NIMH, Wellcome Trust, they all wanted mechanism of action studies. How does this actually work? But the FDA doesn't care about that. FDA cares about safety and efficacy, and so they wouldn't fund our phase 3. So and the Department of Defense and the VA, it was still too hot politically, so I was very disappointed for a day or so, and I was thinking, this is really a bummer because we need all this more money, and it's not coming from the sources that have all these incentives to pay for it. And then I started realizing that this is fine, this is good, because now I'll be able to say that we're going to be able to raise the money. It might take longer, but it'll be a gift from the psychedelic community, from the burner community to the world, and we don't have to say the government helped in any way. But then what happened to change how I describe it is two different things that changed. One is that in December, there was a 2-paragraph little announcement in Reddit that a new fund was being created called the Pineapple Fund. How many of you have heard of the Pineapple Fund? Okay, I'd say a small fraction of you. So it turns out that what this announcement was, this was an announcement that an early Bitcoin investor had all these Bitcoins, and he of course wanted to remain anonymous, and so he announced in December that he was going to give away 5,600 Bitcoins, which at the time were worth $88 million. And I didn't know anything about this, but several people saw it, emailed M.A.P.S staff, and one of the M.A.P.S staff wrote a 1-page grant application, sent it to Pine at the Pineapple Fund, and the next day we get an email says, I'm giving you $1 million. And then 2 hours later, the Bitcoin showed up in our wallet. And then 4 days later, we got another $1 million in Bitcoins from we have no idea who it was from. And then we get this email from Pine saying, I'd be open to talking to you about a matching grant. And we're like, great, okay, that sounds really, really good. And so we talked a lot about it, but in the process, I got to get to know him a little bit better through emails and trying to find out what motivated him. And what he said was that he had borderline personality disorder and he had depression, and he decided to go for therapy. And he wasn't sure what therapy to go for, and he decided to go for ketamine therapy. So ketamine is considered the most important discovery in neuroscience for depression in the last 30 years. And there's now 1,000 ketamine clinics in America for refractory depression. It's being seen mostly just as a pharmacological drug without therapy. They just give ketamine. It tends to help people for short periods of time. They need repeated doses. Occasionally it'll help people permanently. But he went for ketamine therapy. And under the influence of ketamine, he had a vision. And this vision was that there was a simple way for him to get out of depression and get out of borderline personality. And the simple way for him to get out of that was to help other people. And if you've ever tried this when you're depressed, to help other people is really a tremendous way to get out of being wrapped up in your own mind. And so he decided that the best way he could help other people was to give away more than half of his wealth in bitcoins. And so then he proposed that he would give us a $4 million matching grant. And we negotiated what would the match be, how do we work that out, and we had from January 10th to March 10th to raise this $4 million. And we managed to do it with a week to spare. And so he sent us 4 million more bitcoins. This was also at the peak of the Bitcoin, so the price was going down, so he would be sending us more and more Bitcoins. And so in the end, he gave away $55 million within 2.5 months. And the Pineapple Fund is now gone. There's a legacy of where he gave all the money to. That inspired other people, as I mentioned, from the cryptocurrency community. So now what I say, well, I'll say one other thing. So one other person formed the support that we need for Phase 3. And that was someone from the right wing. And that was a woman named Rebecca Mercer. And so for those of you who have studied the election, there's a lot of concern about a company called Cambridge Analytica that sort of scraped all this data off of Facebook and then used it to target ads, maybe even telling some of the Russians how to target certain places. They were the main funders of Trump and Steve Bannon. So the Mercers are responsible more than anybody else for Trump being elected. And Rebecca Mercer, it turned out, started feeling like she doesn't actually agree with everything Trump does. Thank goodness. She opened to the talk of $1 million donation, $250,000 a year for 4 years, but that just talking to me wasn't enough. She had to talk to some senior people in the military. And it turned out in 2010, after we published our first study with MDMA, mostly in women, but a few veterans, that I was contacted out of the blue, actually up in the blue. I was contacted by a brigadier general flying in a military plane, calling me from the plane, and saying, I just read your paper about MDMA for PTSD. What's going on here? And this was a woman, Lori Sutton, who was the highest ranking psychiatrist in the military. She started the Defense Center for Excellence at the Department of Defense in Psychological Health and Traumatic Brain Injury, and she's become an ally over the years. Now, I'm a draft resistor. I was planning to go to jail instead of going to Vietnam. And so all these connections with the military are kind of astonishing for me and very healing. I never was a conscientious objector because I didn't feel pacifism was the way to go. But this connection with Lori Sutton, who really cares compassionately about PTSD, she's now head of Veterans Affairs for the city of New York. And so Rebecca said, who could I talk to that would, be sort of from the establishment world? And I said, Lori Sutton. And so we had this three-way conversation. It took about 10 minutes, and afterwards Rebecca said, okay, I'm in for $1 million. So now what I say is that we are bringing MDMA to the world as a gift from the psychedelic, burner, cryptocurrency, and right-wing communities. And so we are now at this place where we are trying to globalize MDMA. We've been having a series of discussions with the European Medicines Agency. We just had a meeting in person in London, June 10th, and about 3 weeks after that we got the results. This process started actually in January, so we have a long process with the European Medicines Agency, and in the end what they said is that they will accept the FDA data, and that they just want one study done in Europe, and that they're very interested in having geographical distribution throughout Europe, but they especially want us to work with refugees and migrants with PTSD, because they see that's one of the things that's tearing Europe apart. And so they're saying to us, see if maybe MDMA can be part of a solution to that. Now, it's difficult for us to work with people that are in a situation where they're being constantly re-traumatized, because that's not gonna, it's not gonna work if people are not fundamentally safe. So we have to wait for refugees to have been assimilated a little bit, and we're likely to get a bunch of refugees from Germany, from Portugal, from elsewhere. So it's roughly $9 million, we think, to make MDMA a medicine in Europe, and we've raised $400,000. So we're looking for $8.6 million, and that's what we hope to raise within the next 4 to 6 months. I mean, it's very ambitious. I don't know where it's going to come from, but there's a bunch of people here at Burning Man who could write a check for that. And so we're trying to ask them, but we're trying to do this all in a nonprofit context. And what we've done is, with the FDA, we have done a similar kind of a discussion to move to phase 3 that we've just done with EMA, and it's called Special Protocol Assessment. And what that means is you negotiate every aspect of your phase 3 design and all the other information that they're going to want, and if you come to agreement, you get an agreement letter, which we got on July 28th, and what that means is the FDA is legally bound to approve MDMA if we get statistically significant evidence of efficacy from this design and no new safety problems come up. And since MDMA has been taken by tens of millions of people and hundreds of millions of doses for decades, we have a very clear idea of the safety profile of MDMA. And in fact, people have mostly taken MDMA in riskier circumstances than in our therapeutic setting, mixed with other drugs, MDMA with alcohol, MDMA with cocaine, MDMA with who knows what else, and 2 days in a row or 3 days in a row. And so we have a very clear idea of the safety profile. And so we have this special protocol assessment. So no matter what Trump and Sessions want to do, if we get, and they're not going to want to go after veterans anyway. Most people that have PTSD are not veterans. Most of them are women from sexual abuse or people in abusive childhoods or accidents, different ways. We're focusing on the veterans, but they're not, we're going to enroll more people who are non-veterans in phase 3 than veterans, but the veterans have sort of been a way politically to kind of change people's minds. And so recently, I mean, in the last panel, George Greer talked about one of the things he was most surprised about, and it was the coverage that we've got on Fox News. So we've got incredibly good coverage on Fox News. And there's one in particular, May 2nd is when we published our paper about the results from the Veterans, Firefighters, and Police Officers study. And we gave an exclusive to the New York Times. And in the New York Times, they had one sentence about how we had $1 million from Rebecca Mercer. Now, they also are major investors in Breitbart as well. So, the Breitbart and Cambridge Analytica and all this, yeah. So the Mercers own Breitbart. They're super connected. They're not the majority stockholders, they like to say, just minority, but connected to Breitbart, super connected to Fox News. And so the fact that the New York Times had this one sentence about Rebecca Mercer donating, it sort of gave the Fox News people this sense that they could report on this in a positive way. So the very next day, there was this 6-minute segment by Greg Gutfeld. There's a group called The Five, and Jesse Waters are the two main hosts. The woman who's now the girlfriend of Donald Trump Jr. was on that panel, and they're all talking about how MDMA should be made into a medicine, and they're talking about how the strategy of working with veterans is a terrific strategy, and they're joking about how if we'd worked with IT workers, nobody would care, but veterans, they care, and they talked about, they sort of tried to remember who I was, and then it went to this discussion with the whole group. So it's, if you do Greg Gutfeld, the 5, MDMA, PTSD, you'll get to this segment. It's absolutely astonishing, because then they started endorsing psilocybin for depression, ketamine for depression, marijuana for anything medical. So we have this total support from Fox News about what we're doing. And we also have all of the military websites, Stars and Stripes, all the military websites and newsletters are all sympathetic. So we have managed to build bipartisan support. So now what I want to do is sort of talk a little bit about some ethical issues, and then we'll sort of open it up for discussion. So one of these ethical issues has to do with working with the military. So one of the psychiatrists that we work with in Europe is from Germany, and he's, a lot of people in Europe see our military as a very aggressive force, and it has been that in a lot of different ways. So this fellow was saying, would you give MDMA to concentration camp guards? Are you taking people who are uncomfortable from traumatizing people, from having killed innocent people or been part of this war, and then patching them up and then they go back to war? Is that what you're doing? And is that ethical? So first off, I'll say, and then I'll be also in the questions curious what you all think about this, but first off I'll say that this criticism or potential criticism is due for every single medical advance. Everything that you want to do to help people survive, to help them, be able to be healthy. Sometimes we can help people go back to the battlefield. Is that a bad thing? Or what I feel actually, and what I see from these veterans, first off, it's not active duty soldiers, so we don't have that exact question. But secondly, we see that MDMA reverses some of the training they got in the military. And I just heard a story yesterday from one of the vets that was in our study. I didn't hear it from him, I heard it from the therapist, about how he felt that the military training actually changed his brain. And so here, this is the year I, Robot, and so he felt that the military training made them into robots and changed their brains and changed the way they operated to their emotions, and that the MDMA was deprogramming the military programming to making them sensitive to the emotional consequences of what they did. And so I don't think that we're making people heartless killers, because then they go, it's like getting, you go to confession and now it's okay, and now you can go back and do whatever you want. It's not actually like that. And I also think that we have an obligation both to victims and to perpetrators to try to heal everybody. And I think that's more of a delicate and a difficult situation, but I think that we need to look at those people that are perpetrators are in many cases victims themselves at an earlier stage of their life, and that we need to recognize that. I was, one of the Israeli psychiatrists that we worked with at one point said, I understand MDMA, he'd never done it himself, it only works for victims, not for perpetrators. And that's where I realized that our training program wasn't really working well, and that it really is for everybody. So I think this idea of working with the military, ethically, I feel that it's a good thing to do. And similarly, working with police, or working with other kind of first responders, or working with prison guards, or those kind of, or working with people who have sexually abused others. To the extent they're willing to enter into our studies, I think that we should work with both victims and perpetrators. So that's one ethical issue. One of the other ones has been that we've gotten a lot of criticism for is accepting this donation from Rebecca Mercer. So for me, it was one of the most important things that we were able to do. And building bipartisan support is one of the crucial issues as we move forward to try to move beyond research to make these into medicines. And so people have said that you're trying to make her look good, and she should look bad, and she does all these bad things. Why? And that everything is tainted, and that you. So there's a whole thing in philanthropy. It's called toxic donors, and do you work with them or not? Some of the people that have, ripped off people, in the stock market, and then do you take their money or different things like that? So I feel like it's very important for us to build these bipartisan bridges. And so I think taking the money from Rebecca Mercer was not only, helpful for us, but people don't recognize that it's a two-way conversation, that maybe she will learn something from our work. And maybe that will change some of her ideas. People are worried that now we're going to be, controlled by Rebecca Mercer, and we're going to be having to do things. But the only condition that she put on the money was that it go to veterans. There's been other donors that have, the more pressure that I've actually received from donors has been from left-wing donors who say, we're starting to make MDMA into a medicine, but you're talking about the need to legalize drugs. You're talking about, so the fundamental point I'll make here is that why I'm doing this, why I think it's so important that we mainstream psychedelics is beyond medicine. It's that we need to have millions and millions of people have a spiritual connection so that they can break through these us-them barriers, and then they can have compassion for the other and see that we're all connected. That's the fundamental theory of change. I think we saw that a lot in the 60s, that people were motivated by psychedelics and were able then to participate in opposing the Vietnam War and working on the environmental movement, the women's rights movement, civil rights movement. There is this connection, I think, between this mystical experience, the sense of spirituality, and political outcomes. And there's actually been a study recently at the London College with Robin Carhart-Harris, and he's actually demonstrated that there's a correlation between the mystical experience, nature-relatedness, progressive views, and anti-authoritarian views. Now, all of this is mediated by the context, so it's not that you take the drug and you automatically have these things. You can take the drug and be worse off. But if you take the drug in a supportive therapeutic setting, you touch into some of these experiences, it has a very strong, I think, political implications, and that's why I'm doing it. And this, for me, was confirmed in 1983 by the Assistant Secretary General of the UN, Robert Mueller. I talk about him a lot. He wrote this book called New Genesis, Shaping a Global Spirituality, which I read in '83. And his theory is that we have the United Nations to mediate conflicts between countries, but a lot of those conflicts are actually religious-based. And that what we need to do is help all these fundamentalists and all these different religions relax a little bit. And we need a bit of this global spirituality for them to realize that religions are like languages. We have all these different languages. They're all about essentially communicating with each other. Each language has a different flavor, different words for things, but a full understanding, a mystical understanding of religion is that they're all basically coming from the same place. We have different symbols, different cultural contexts, but we don't need to be so rigid and fundamentalist about it. And so that was the thesis of his book. And so I was an undergraduate at the time. I wrote him a letter. I felt like I was like a sailor on a shipwrecked sailor on a deserted island, and I put a little note in a bottle, and I sent it off into the universe, and I sent it to him, and he actually wrote me back. And then he said, I said, you didn't say anything about psychedelics in your book. And I said, psychedelics, whether you consider them real or similar to, they're a way to understand spirituality, and would you help us bring back psychedelic research? And he actually said, yes, he would help. And he believed in that theory of change, and then he referred me to a bunch of mystics in different religions. And reading between the lines, I heard him say, send them all MDMA. Which I then did. And then they would report back to him. Roman Catholic monks who took MDMA in a monastery, Zen Buddhists who took it in Zen meditation retreats, Jewish rabbis who took it and compared MDMA to the Sabbath. So anyway, that's the theory of change, is that we need widespread mass mental health, global spirituality, and that, when we think about Trump and we think about what if we gave MDMA to Trump, for example, I don't think it would work, because you have to want to change. And our whole approach is to empower people to change themselves, to heal themselves. That's the essence of this inner directed method, that we are helping people to marshal their own inner resources to heal themselves. And of the 8-hour session, roughly 4 hours on average, more or less, people's eyes are closed, they're listening to music, and they're having incredible poetic metaphors and imagery about their own inner conflicts. It's astonishing how metaphorical people are in the way they tell themselves stories about what's going on with their life. And, you know, one of the veterans had this story of he was there for rage. He never hit his wife, but he threw stuff at her. He was flying off the handle all the time. And he had this idea of the warrior part of himself was locked in a cage inside him. And was actually had reached out with one arm with a knife and had stabbed him in the side. That he was in battle with this warrior part of himself that was uncontrollable, and he had to keep it under control. And under the influence of MDMA, he realized that that warrior self had kept him alive, that that was an ally, that was part of his patriotism, that was something he had to make friends with. And they had this whole imagery of letting this wild animal out of the cage and becoming friends. So people are having these incredible metaphors of while they're going through healing, but roughly 4 hours is speaking to the therapist, roughly 4 hours is having the points where people heal themselves. And so this is this concept that if we were to give it to Trump, if he didn't really want to deal with what was going on, he wouldn't be healed. And I saw that in a sad way, I'll say, with John Lilly. And so, who knows who John Lilly is? Somebody? Okay. He invented the flotation tank. And in the 50s and 60s, and he was the one that started about dolphin intelligence, and he was an early LSD researcher, paid for by the Navy. He actually did work with flotation tanks doing LSD inside the flotation tank. And his book was called Programming and Metaprogramming the Human Biocomputer. And when psychedelics got criminalized, sadly, he was so ahead of his time and impatient that he just retreated into ketamine addiction. And I had an opportunity to work with him later in his life with MDMA for a therapeutic purpose. And he sort of came into his body and saw all the abscesses that he had where he was injecting himself with ketamine. And it was so difficult for him that he didn't really want to deal with it. And so he sort of withdrew again. So I learned from that it's not about just creating a safe space and giving people MDMA. They have to have the courage to change. And if they don't want to do that, they won't. And so it's not about changing Trump, but what about the millions and millions of people who have given away their power to Trump, who have been motivated by fears and anxieties and have given away their power? So I think the ultimate solution for a more peaceful planet is going to be anchoring this sort of global spirituality in millions and billions of people so that they don't give away. Because there will always be people who want to be dictators, who won't want to change. We can never really end all that, but we can end, hopefully, this idea of people giving away their power by helping them process their own fears and anxieties. And that means going beyond medicine, going beyond religion to drug legalization and to a post-prohibition world. The Zendo here is about building a model for a post-prohibition world. So that here we have, you know, one of the main reasons for the main reason for the backlash of the 60s was people getting involved with political change movements and the identification of LSD with the counterculture. Nixon said that Leary was the most dangerous man in America. And so I think that was people having this mystical, spiritual sense, and then realizing, why do I want to kill these Vietnamese? Why do I want to trash the environment? You know, so I think it was psychedelics going right that caused this conflict with the society so rigid. Now, 50 years later, we're in a much different position. The society has integrated much of the psychedelic vision of the 60s. So people at that time, well, you know, you remember the Maharishi who came with meditation with TM. He was a strange, weird foreign import. And now, you know, they teach meditation to children in schools as part of mindfulness. So we've integrated that. You know, foreign religions, you know, yoga was considered to be, it was going to convert people to a different kind of religion. now every YMCA has yoga classes. We didn't really talk about death in the 60s. The first hospice wasn't until 1974. And so now we have over 6,000 hospices. Birth, women were tranquilized and men were not allowed in the delivery room for a lot of births. Now we have birthing centers. So we've changed our attitudes towards birth, towards death, towards spirituality, towards the environment, and now the last thing from that is to integrate is the psychedelics. And so the main reason for a backlash now would be parents worried about their kids, worried about their family members. And a lot of that will come from going to festivals and then taking psychedelics and not being prepared for the depth of the experience, and then coming back home worse off. So in 2003, we started the Zendo Project, or we didn't call it the Zendo Project, but we started coming here to Burning Man to offer therapy. We brought therapists who are trained in psychedelics to help people with difficult trips. And that has evolved from 2003 to now, where we have over 300 volunteers that staff the Zendo 24/7. It's on the Esplanade at 545 and E. It's right out in the open. It's in the greeter package. And last year we had over 660 people came for support, sometimes while they were tripping, sometimes afterwards, trying to integrate it. And so the Zendo Project is really part of a model to demonstrate how do we move for a post-prohibition world. Because when adults are free to do these drugs without worry about the police, people will still get into trouble. And so we can provide these support systems. So anyway, I've been getting a fair amount of criticism from people for doing that, for talking about prohibition, but I think it actually makes it more likely we'll be able to make it into a medicine than less likely, because it takes away some of the fear of where we might go. So the other last sort of ethical issue, there's two more. One is we've been getting criticism recently for, there's a for-profit and a non-profit group that's developing psilocybin into a medicine. And our view as a non-profit, that we have the ability to give tax deductions to people who give us donations. We have an obligation to the public to be transparent, to give out all of our information, and to help everybody, whether that's for-profit or non-profit. And so that's our fundamental view. And so we've been getting a lot of criticism for sharing all of our FDA regulatory documents and all of the information we know about the drug development system with this for-profit company called Compass. And there's a non-profit company called USONA. So my view of this is that we should celebrate the fact that for-profit companies are coming into this, because that means we have succeeded. For the last 32 years of M.A.P.S, it only makes sense for the last year or so for for-profit people to come, because we've changed the political dynamics, we've changed the dynamics with the regulatory systems, and so now it can make sense for investors. And so I think that makes sense. And also, though, the for-profit is not going to be able to block the non-profit. We will have the head of the non-profit, USONA, Bill Litton, is here camping with us. And so it's their view that whatever the for-profit does, it's not going to block them from what they do. And so I think it's really good for us. But there's some people that are worried about what they might charge. For those of you who watch about medical marijuana, the FDA just approved a drug called Epidiolex, which is CBD for childhood epilepsy. It just got approved. The pharmaceutical company is charging $32,500 a year for stuff you can get for a couple $1,000s from your local neighborhood dispensary. But it's going to be covered by insurance. They did on all the research, so there are problems with for-profit drug development. But anyway, I think we should help everybody, and that's what we've been doing. The final ethical issue has to do with where we bring MDMA. And so in September, I'm going to China with one of our therapists and the leader of our clinical team. And what has happened is that this young Chinese internet entrepreneur made hundreds of millions of dollars, left China, lives in San Francisco, and wants to bring MDMA back to China. And he says that his parents and his parents' generation all have PTSD from the Cultural Revolution, and that you can't say that in China. You have to talk about PTSD from natural disasters or other things, but that he wants to try to bring the healing potential of MDMA to China. And he thinks, though, that the only way to do it is to start with the Chinese military psychiatrists and the Chinese civilian psychiatrists there as well. So we had this. So when I think about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing to try to bring MDMA to the Chinese military psychiatrists, it turns out that the Israeli principal investigator was the chief psychiatrist for the Israeli Defense Forces. He's one of the therapists coming to Israel with us. That the fellow who's with us camping now, who's going to coordinate our research in Europe, he is the, as I mentioned, he's the chief psychiatrist for the Dutch Ministry of Defense. In England, we're working with the chief psychiatrist for the British military. So that that's where a lot of the PTSD is located, and that's where a lot of the PTSD researchers are located. And so there is this sense that I have that, moving into an authoritarian country, we all know that the CIA had MK Ultra, where they used psychedelics for mind control. They tried to use them for brainwashing, things like that. That developed into such scandal that as far as we can tell, that's not happening anymore. And that these drugs can be misused. But I think fundamentally, MDMA helps you, when you take it, it helps you feel solid in yourself. It reduces your pain threshold. I mean, it increases your pain threshold, so you don't feel pain as much. And if you're sort of a true believer, I think it will strengthen your ability to resist anything. So the question is, in this trade-off, if so much of the governments are motivated by people who are motivated by their trauma. So it's this multi-generational trauma that causes the fear of the other. So my view is that I think on balance it's a good thing for us to go to China and to try to influence the Chinese therapists to try to influence MDMA. And I think if there's any pressure from the Chinese government, from what we've seen so far, it's going to be to limit the spread of it rather than to take it over and do it other ways. So I think there are ethical issues as we go forward, and we need to be careful about them, because we have a chance that we have not had in 50 years, and it's a tremendous opportunity. And for those of you that are interested in careers, for example, in psychedelic psychotherapy, now is the first time that that's a realistic thing. And to give you a sense of how realistic it is, and then I'll be done with this talk and we'll have questions, is that we anticipate that MDMA is going to be approved in 2021 in the United States. Depending on the fundraising, it could be that time, or it could be 6 months or a year later, or whenever. It'll be approved 2021, 2022 in Europe. But there's a program that the FDA has called Expanded Access. And the Republicans, in their anti-deregulation efforts, anti-regulation, deregulation, they just passed a bill called Right to Try. And Right to Try means, and Trump just signed this bill about a month and a half ago. So Right to Try means that if you have, if you have a condition for which the available medicines have not worked, and there's a drug that's being studied for that condition, you should have a right to try that drug before it's approved, at your own risk, because you still don't know about the full safety of it, and at your own cost. You should be able to pay for the drug, pay for the therapy, whatever, and you should get it outside, simultaneous, actually, before the drug is approved as a medicine. So the FDA doesn't particularly like Right to Try because it cuts them out of the process. People negotiate directly with pharmaceutical companies, and the agreement is that whatever happens in this compassionate use, Right to Try, the FDA won't review that data for safety and efficacy. So the pharmaceutical companies aren't that worried about making it available. The FDA has a program called Expanded Access, which is similar to Right to Try, but it's a little bit more paperwork and a little bit more data. So we're going to go the Expanded Access route. And so what that means is that next summer, and we've already had meetings with FDA and DEA about this, because everybody who works at an Expanded Access site, it's still a Schedule I drug before it's a medicine, and they'll need DEA Schedule I licenses. But we anticipate next summer, the end of next summer, we're going to be starting Expanded Access clinics, so that we're going to be training therapists for Expanded Access. So actually, psychedelic psychotherapy legally, where patients are coming in to pay for treatment, is going to start in 1 year from now. And it's only for PTSD, it's only for treatment-resistant PTSD, but it can be expanded to, like, for example, we did this study with autistic adults with social anxiety. We could end up having expanded access for social anxiety. We did a study with end of life, people with anxiety about end of life with MDMA. That was helpful. We could get expanded access for that. But we have limited resources. We're focusing on PTSD, but the good news is that everything seems to be pointing in the direction of success, and I think it's incumbent upon us to think as carefully as we can about the ethical issues, to proceed very carefully, and if so, I think we will be able to embed psychedelics in our culture, and then what will happen is from 2021 or so to 2031, we'll be able to lay out and spread thousands of psychedelic clinics throughout America and throughout the world. There's 14,500 drug abuse treatment centers. Psychedelics can be very helpful for the treatment of addiction. There's 6,000, as I said, hospice centers, but I think there'll be specialized clinics where people will go to get psilocybin, ketamine, MDMA, whatever drugs get further approved. There'll be a new profession, a new professional organization to be certified to be a psychedelic therapist, with therapists cross-trained in all these different drugs. And I think after we have about 10 or 15 years of that, the population of America will be ready to fully legalize psychedelics, and all other drugs will move to so our target date for that is 2035 for a post-prohibition world. I hope that we'll all be around to see if my predictions are accurate. Hopefully I'm too pessimistic, but I think that that's the track we're on, and I think it's not going to be any day too soon, because we are facing such environmental crisis, such crisis of weaponry, and our emotions are trapping us. This trauma of multi-generation is trapping us, and so we're hoping that mainstream psychedelics will make a contribution to helping the human species survive and thrive. I know I talked a bunch, but hopefully I didn't talk too long, and I look forward now to a dialogue. Do we have another microphone?
Right here.
Besides dose, dissociation, and desire to change, what trends do you see in responders versus non-responders?
We don't know much more than that. Yeah, so one of the things that the FDA has required us to do, phase 4, post-approval, is to look at the pediatric cases. But they also wanted to look at non-responders and relapsers. So we're not actually sure. I think that's a really crucial question, because in psychotherapy, one of the main issues is how do you match the patient to the right kind of therapy? What is that crossover? And that's what you want to figure out. Now, one way people have talked about doing that is with biomarkers. So maybe there are some genetic or physiological conditions that will lead some people to be able to, first off, be resilient to trauma, or if they have PTSD, be able to recover more likely. So far, there's been no real reliable biomarkers. We know a little bit about what changes before and after treatment with the reduction of activity in the amygdala, but part of it is whether people have a safe place while they're doing this deep work. So I'd add that people need to be safe to process all the pain and the trauma, and if they're continually re-traumatized, that's going to be an issue. One of the things that the FDA has talked about is that once we give this 3 sessions, how long do we wait? How many times can people go through that? And so they've not yet said about setting an upper limit, but it's going to be studied in adults, but have never studied in children, but they're being prescribed in children. That's why we have to do pediatric studies with MDMA. The FDA is trying to crack down on that and require studies in pediatric population. But the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association, the AMA, all these different groups protested the DEA, and the DEA had to withdraw that. So there is off-label prescription even for drugs that have come from Schedule 1. Now, what we're saying also is that the only people that can prescribe this are people that we have trained in our method. Eventually, there'll be other people training them as well. But what we're saying is that once they know our method, they know how the drug was used, they can innovate, and they don't need to keep using our method. They can modify it in any number of different ways, blend it with any other therapies, whatever. And the problem of off-label prescription, so that counts as off-label if you use it in a different therapeutic method. But the real question is about all sorts of other conditions. And so what I wanted to do was to have a patient registry, and then have every time a doctor would prescribe MDMA, would be a little form to say what it was prescribed for. So we would keep track of all the off-label prescriptions, and eventually we'd say, oh, look at all this use, now let's study that. And try to make, because the thing about off-label prescription is that insurance will not cover it. That's a big issue for us, because most of the people who are traumatized come from populations that have the least resources to pay for treatment. So there's a big equity issue. So it's very important that we get this covered by insurance. So insurance will only cover what you've studied it for. They won't cover off-label uses. The other thing is that in order to defend yourself against medical malpractice, you have to have what's called a significant minority of your peers to support what you're doing. So for every off-label use, if there's a significant minority of your peers, which means maybe some prominent psychiatrists think it's okay to give MDMA for OCD, then you could. So there will be off-label prescription, but the pharmaceutical companies are prohibited from actually encouraging or even tracking off-label prescription. So we were told, don't do the patient registry, don't ask the doctors to tell you what they're prescribing it for when it's off-label, but just be blind to that, and try to think on your own what other uses that it can be used for. So our goal is make MDMA into a medicine for PTSD. Then we will sell it for a profit through the M.A.P.S Benefit Corporation, because selling MDMA for a profit is taxable. So we've created this benefit corp where we maximize public benefit, not profit. And we're working with ethicists at UPenn to articulate a whole series of metrics to evaluate the public benefit. And then the Public Benefit Corporation is for profit, but it's owned 100% by the nonprofit. So whatever profits are made are going to go for other research. So that's our goal, is to try to get money from selling MDMA for PTSD and study all these off-label prescriptions. But once MDMA is a medicine, as long as you've been through our training program, then you can use it in any way for any condition. But I do think that we want to roll this out. So medicalization is not the same as legalization. We see from medical marijuana that in 1996, Arizona and California passed the first medical marijuana laws, and now 22 years later, there's 60% of the American public is in favor of marijuana legalization for all uses. So medicalization will lead to legalization, but we don't want to, but for medicalization, it isn't legalization. I feel fine having it highly controlled. So this is where we get pushback from libertarians, who are a lot of our donors, like all these Bitcoin people tend to be libertarians. And they're like, why are you suggesting that it's only under direct supervision, only for certain things? So I think we need to work with the system, work on incremental change, and part of that is all these limitations for the risk evaluation and mitigation strategies.
Dr. Doblin, another follow-up question. Thank you again for all that you do on behalf of humanity. And me too. What would somebody do if they wanted to get involved and get trained by you and set up a clinic?
Well, that's a very good question. So right now we have 5,000 therapists on a list to be notified when we want to start our training program. So so the first thing to do is to sign up on our website to be notified for when we open up training opportunities. So this is the key bottleneck for us. And it's very challenging. Now, I mean, it's been so easy for a lot of M.A.P.S for the 32 years. Most of M.A.P.S was just asking for permission to do stuff and getting rejected. And so that wasn't that hard. Now we're sort of seeing success, and people are saying, how are you going to scale up? And the most important challenge for us now is scaling up therapists. But we only have 4 trainers so far. So we're starting new programs to train more trainers. So the first thing is sign up on the website. We're trying to put more and more of what we do on the website. There's also the treatment manual that describes our treatment approach, which is for free on the website under the MDMA page at the bottom, so read that. And we're starting to think that we can train, our trainings can be the maximum of 60 people at a time. So we're going to have a training for 60 people in Europe at the end of September. Hopefully we'll have a training in November in Colombia, for Colombia, Chile, and Argentina, South American therapists. In the end of January, February, we're going to have a training in Israel. The Ministry of Health has given us 50 people can now take MDMA on a compassionate basis and expanded access while we move through phase 3. So we're going to train a bunch more therapists for that. And then we're going to come back to the U.S. and start training for expanded access. So the first training is going to be in March. We're going to have one every 2 months. And we're going to try to pick people who are geographically distributed in areas where we don't already have phase 3 studies, so we can, reach more people. And you'll have to start building a team. So if you apply on the website, and you can write to Shannon, S-H-A-N-N-O-N, Shannon at mapsbcorp.com. We have kind of a list of things to do to prepare to have an expanded access site. So you have to have a doctor. So if you're a therapist, you have to have a doctor, because the DEA only gives Schedule I licenses to doctors. You have to have a facility that's capable of having overnight stays. Ideally, you would have a team. You would have 2 male-female teams at least, so that you can learn from each other as you start treating it. And you'll have to start thinking about what the fees are going to be charged. Is there money that we can get from places to subsidize treatments for people who can't afford it? But the key thing is that we don't want there to be a backlash because people were treated in ways that were not completely ethical or not completely effective. So our pressure is there's 8 million people with PTSD in America, roughly. So how do we ever possibly do that? It's going to take us a very long time to try to figure out how to expand our training program. But we anticipate thousands of therapists. And so for now, one of the best ways is to volunteer to work at Zendo. So we use Zendo to train therapists, because you've got a flow of people coming in with all different drugs, in different combinations, and working with them to try to help them turn that into something productive is one of the best trainings. So, and we have Zendo that works at other events all over the place. So volunteer for Zendo. And I think really that it's a tricky thing for me to say, but I think practice with your friends and practice with other people. The MDMA does a lot of the work. And so you can create a safe space and you can learn with people who are suffering different things, and we're all suffering something. We may not have a clinical diagnosis, but I'd say practice with your friends and practice with people that are suffering and learn that way. And then, come out of the closet to the extent that you can to educate people so that it becomes less stigmatized. And hopefully we will have eventually training programs that you could be part of, without waiting, multi years. So that's the best way to get there.
Hi. So you mentioned at some point that the treatment works better with women than men. Did I get that right?
No, that was the SSRIs.
Oh.
So the prescription medications for PTSD work better in women than in men.
Okay.
But
There we go.
MDMA, fortunately, seems to work well in men as well as women. So we're, so there's hope for us guys. Yeah. I mean, the question is, are women closer to their emotions? And that's why we think SSRIs work a little bit better for women than men. But they have kind of a milder effect. And people have also asked, do you change the doses so that women get a lower dose than men? They tend to weigh less, so that would be, do you dose by milligram per kilogram? Well, we don't do that. And it seems like the thing people have often said about the women is that often many of them have complex PTSD from, childhood, multiple incidents. And so it does work well with complex PTSD or war PTSD. I guess the other question is, are women, better therapists than men? So I don't think that's necessarily true, but I do think that this idea of a male-female team is pretty incredible to see it in motion. And for some reason, many of our male-female teams are married or are romantically involved. I didn't think it would develop that way, but I mentioned we have 4 trainers. They happen to be 2 married couples. So more and more, it turns out that these male-female teams are in a romantic relationship. Because it's kind of a very loving situation to be there nurturing somebody who's trying to go through painful stuff. So they have to have a really good relationship, even if they're not married.
Hi, Rick. I wanted to reiterate my gratitude and thanks again for everything. I was curious about the inclusion of holotropic breathwork in the training of the therapists.
So holotropic breathwork, again, is hyperventilation that reduces your defenses and stuff comes to the surface. Holotropic breathwork is more like LSD than it is like MDMA, but it's legal. And so most of the therapists, or I'd say many of the therapists that we've worked with, have been trained by Stan and Christina Groff in the holotropic breathwork. So I was trained in that from 88 to 91. Michael Midhofer and Andy Midhofer, who are our lead therapists, have been trained in the breathwork. And so we have used holotropic breathwork in the middle of the training, because more and more now we're working with people who are traditional therapists and psychiatrists who don't have a psychedelic background. And so we do use holotropic breathwork to try to help people learn about letting go. That was before we got, and even still more recently we do that. Many underground psychedelic therapists start with a conversation with people to get to know them, then they do holotropic breathwork to see how they respond, and then they move to the psychedelics. So I think holotropic breathwork is a really good way to help train therapists in their own process of letting go. And the fact that it's harder than MDMA is actually good in the training of therapists, because you see how scared you are about letting go. You don't know what's coming up. And you don't have the safety reduction of fear from MDMA that you don't get that with the breathwork. So it requires a little bit more courage, you could say, in the breathwork. So it's been a very effective tool for us in the training of therapists. And we're likely to continue using it that way. We don't use it in the treatment. And I'll say that the reason that we don't is that we only want to have one intervention at a time. And so the FDA would not look kindly on, oh, you're doing this and that. Well, what is the contributor to people getting better? So we don't use holotropic breathwork in the treatment, even though in underground settings, people often do go through a series of breathwork before they do the psychedelics. And I would say back about this post-approval. Post-approval, once it's a prescription medicine, I think holotropic breathwork will be used a lot before people start with MDMA for PTSD.
Hi, thanks for everything that you're doing to advance society as a whole. A few friends and I get together a few times a year, and we call it communion. Getting to the basis of what we're doing. Sometimes we enter in with intentions, what we want to resolve at the time. sometimes we just enter in and deal with what comes up. Have you noticed any difference in those kinds of aspects, going in with an intention of, I want to resolve whatever my issue is with this, as opposed to just whatever bubbles to the surface?
Well, the approach that we use is a little bit of a combination of that. So it's important to have intentions, and I think these intentions are focusing, and they help your psyche try to, and they mobilize energy. But once the session starts, we say throw away those intentions, and then just deal with whatever comes up. And that's this idea of this inner healing intelligence and the inner healer, that somehow or other, you may have an intention of one thing, and before you know it, you're dealing with something completely different, and maybe that's actually what you needed to deal with. So I think that it's very good as part of the preparation to use intentions. We say, we have an agreement with the people, and we say, if during the MDMA session you don't start talking about the trauma, at some point we will bring it up. Because it's our view that you have to speak about the trauma, you have to reprocess it in order to heal from PTSD. And so we sort of set that intention ahead of time. At some point, if you don't talk about it, we'll ask you some questions about the trauma. But because we have this inner-directed approach and an 8-hour session, and we're quite patient, we've never actually had to do that. People will eventually gravitate toward that. But some people go to happy memories first, or to a mystical, spiritual sense of connection, or feeling love, and then they'll go to the trauma, so all different ways. So I think if you hold on to the intention while you're having the experience, you're limiting the experience to your conscious mind and to what you thought was you needed to work on. So it's sort of a combination. Have the intentions and then let it go, and then see what comes up.
Hi, Rick. So the news of the efficacy of psychedelics is moving a lot faster than the therapeutic capacity for studying.
Yes, totally.
And I've had a lot of friends ask me recently about self-medicating. Yeah. And I'm in an area of the country that doesn't have these kind of studies happening. So I'm wondering what you would tell people about self-medicating with these substances.
All right, well, let me tell you what happened to me last year at Burning Man. So this guy comes up to me and he gives me a hug and he says, "You saved my life." And I was like, "Well, what did I do?" And he said, "Well, I'm a veteran and I had PTSD and I was feeling suicidal and terrible. And I heard about your study, but I wasn't able to get in your study. And I went to your website and I saw that you posted your treatment manual and I read it. And I found a friend and I found MDMA and I took it and now I feel better." So I think that it's always self-medication in a sense that when we think of, so one of the concerns I have about shamanism is that you tend to have the shaman is the one that heals you. Sometimes the shaman is the only one that takes the drug, and they go into a different state and they try to do, divination, different things to heal you, and they have, feathers and they blow it, all different kind of things. But there's a power dynamic that's a little bit concerning in some shamanistic settings where they're the healer. I mean, this is true with all doctors and all therapists too. It's like, who's really doing the work? And so our understanding of it is that people are always the ones that heal themselves. And we're trying to create a context for them to do that. But that we're not responsible for healing them. We're responsible for creating an environment where they can heal themselves. So it's always self-medication in a sense. So I think it's very important, though, for people to do it in a safe way, to be willing to have the full range of experiences, not to do it alone. So I would say you can self-medicate, but do not do it by yourself. Have a buddy, have somebody there that's the mediator between you and the outside world. And don't really think about it as necessarily one-dose miracle cure. And be willing to give yourself a couple days, particularly, to integrate what happened. And often, it's good to start out with smaller doses just to see if it agrees with you. But, we're trying to make it available as many tools as possible. The hardest thing about self-medicating is knowing that you got a pure drug. So there is one company in America that is called Drug Detection Lab that has a license from the DEA to accept anonymous samples of drugs. And then you put in a code name, and then you contact them, and then you find out what it was. So it's called Drug Detection Lab in Sacramento. And DanceSafe and Arrowhead and M.A.P.S started an ecstasy pill testing program, and we did it with them, with Drug Detection Lab. So I'd say that's very important, because when you get into these difficult emotional states, they're sometimes difficult. And if you're worried, oh my God, did I poison myself? What did I really take? Am I going to get the support I thought I would get? Maybe it's not really MDMA. That complicates things a lot. So I'd say, really make sure that you have confidence that it's a pure drug. And it's a risk because the more severe the situation, the more support people need. So the tendency, like even with self-medication, the fact that in our therapy setting we have overnight stays. You might say, oh, I'll spend the day with you, and then the experience is over, and then the friend goes away, and they're left on their own all night, and things could go really badly. So I'd say you need an even stronger and longer context, safe context, when people are going to try to self-medicate. But that, I think starting low doses, how are we going to reach all these 8 million people? It's going to be a lot of this self-medication. I wish there were more centers and they're all set up and we made, but the challenge for us is not to grow too fast either. Not to surrender quality, to just have massive numbers of therapists, because that would also lead to backlash. So here's another story that's really, really hard. This is now 10 years ago. This fellow contacted me and he said, I'm struggling, I need underground therapists, I want to work with psychedelics, I'm very depressed. And I referred him to my therapist, actually, who I knew did not do underground work, but I thought was a great therapist. And I thought, at least we can try this. So he had months of therapy with my therapist, and then he called me up and he said, it's not enough, I want underground therapy. And we talked a little bit, and then it turned out that he said that he had epileptic seizures in the past. So we don't let people with epilepsy in the studies, only because this is just the initial phase. People with epilepsy have taken MDMA or LSD without triggering a seizure. Even if you get a seizure, you can do stuff. It's not fatal, usually, if you're prepared. But I felt like I couldn't refer this person to an underground therapy setting. So I said, I just couldn't do it. And I didn't hear anything for about a month and a half. And then I got a call from the police. And the police said, do you know this guy? And I said, yeah, I had heard from him. He contacted me, and he wanted to know about therapy, but I didn't have anywhere to refer him to. And the police said, well, that's, we're glad to hear that you knew of him, and the reason we're calling you is because he's committed suicide and he's left you a suicide note. And they said they would send it to me. And so then I got this suicide note, and it turned out he committed suicide the very next day after I told him I couldn't refer him underground therapy. The note was the most gracious, beautiful note. He's like, I'm not blaming you, I'm blaming the system, and I know you did as much as you could, but it's just I can't live like this. And he said, you can use this note to tell people that if these drugs were approved, I might have been one more person saved. So I'm aware that there are people committing suicide because they can't get into our studies. And that's the pressure to try to do it as fast as we can, but not too fast. And so that's why I'm very sympathetic when people say, what about self-medication?
One last question.
Hi, Rick. Thanks again for your work on behalf of making the world more psychologically healthy.
Yeah.
I think it's amazing that there's people with enough passion to do this and just butt up against just a labyrinth of bureaucratic regulations for decades. That said, my friends and I have been recently trying a different psychedelic, mescaline, which there seems to be no studies done by M.A.P.S on it or anywhere that I could find. And we found one very good therapeutic use case for it, and one very specific one, because it's a drug that promotes very authentic communication between people, similar to MDMA. So I was wondering, like, what would it take, if it is at all feasible, to do a mescaline study, like by M.A.P.S or some other
Can
way?
you say what that specific case that you think it's good for?
Well, yes, there are a lot of people who just, their main concern is in life is like what other people think about them. And they just live their whole life worrying about it, and they have theories based on, oh, does this person like me or hate me? And sometimes they're on like either side of the dichotomy. Wednesday and on Thursday, they're like, oh no, maybe this person loves me. Like, oh, maybe they hate me. These could be people in a relationship together. And they could spend their whole lives like thinking this and never find it out. So with mescaline, like that is like the first thing that comes out. It like eliminates like anything that's kind of on your mind, you would like almost inevitably reveal. It's like other drugs like alcohol or something. They let you speak your mind, but at the same time they like incapacitate your mind. And like what you speak is not very lucid, not very eloquent. But in mescaline, you're very lucid, and you could just, in like a kind of autistic, childish way, you very much reveal your, like how you feel about other people, how you feel about yourself towards other people, and that just eliminates it. Like, I've taken it with my girlfriend, who was not depressed at the time, but very depressive, and that very much helped our relationship.
That's great. This is a great question to end on. Mescaline is the most important psychedelic that is not currently being researched. And so it's really good that you brought that up. And I'll say, when I was 18 years old and first starting to do psychedelics at New College in Sarasota, Florida, again, this is 1971, 72, somebody came by with a half a pound of mescaline. And so I bought all of it. And my friends and I proceeded to use it over the next couple months. I had a lot of friends, because we didn't all do it all the time. But mescaline is fantastic. And in 1953, the U.S. Army did, the Chemical Warfare Service of the Army, they tested 8 drugs for toxicity. On the one hand was mescaline, on the other was methamphetamine, and in the middle was MDMA. So that's actually the first test that we're aware of in the U.S. Of MDMA was in this context. So the way to think about MDMA is that it's like methamphetamine in that it makes you alert, and it can keep you up all night, but it doesn't make you jittery the way that methamphetamine will, or you can sit still and be awake all night. And it's like mescaline in that it brings things to the surface, but it doesn't have the visuals, it doesn't have the kind of ego dissolution, but it has the warmth and the heart of mescaline. So MDMA is a good way to think about it, is sort of somewhat of a cross between mescaline and methamphetamine. The reason that mescaline, first off, is very hard to find is that it's not that potent. So you need roughly 400 milligrams or so for a full psychedelic experience. And so underground chemists are looking to make drugs that are more powerful. And, so you can sell more, and you get more money per dose. So mescaline has that disadvantage, you could say, of requiring 400 milligrams or up to half a gram for a full psychedelic experience. You can have a lot of beneficial stuff at lower doses as well. That's also a reason why it's not been yet studied to medicalize. So it's so expensive for us to make these drugs in GMP, good medical practices way, that psilocybin you can do in 20 or 30 milligrams and have a full psychedelic dose. MDMA is up to 125, but then, you just need to be making way, way more, and the price goes up for mescaline when you have to give 400 milligrams or half a gram. That's no reason, no real excuse not to make it into a medicine. It's just to say the economics are a little bit different. And there's a drug that's sort of similar to mescaline called MDA. So it's methylene dioxyamphetamine. It's like a cross between MDMA and LSD a little bit. Right now, there is no resources that we're aware of to work on mescaline, but I think it has incredible healing potential, and I can only hope that one day research will start with mescaline. Thank you all. Oh yeah. For those of you, he asked about 2CB. Again, the challenge with mescaline, a little bit with 2CB, what we're doing is to do the safety studies that are required by FDA are very, very expensive. So what we do is called the keto strategy. We're working with demonized drugs. So right now, if you go to Medline, the repository of medical literature, there's over 5,000 papers of MDMA or ecstasy. About $400 million has been spent. So 2CB also is kind of an LSD, MDMA, a little bit. It's an incredible drug. It has a lot of therapeutic potential, but it hasn't been demonized enough, or it hasn't been used enough so that it would be prohibitively expensive for us to make 2CB into a medicine. In the early 80s, the group that was distributing ecstasy, the Dallas group that was distributing ecstasy, we met with them. And they wanted to distribute, they were wondering about distributing 2CB as well. And so we had this discussion with them about how 2CB, it's potent in 10 milligrams. It's more difficult to dose. If you do, if you make a little bit of a mistake, 20 milligrams, sometimes it's way overwhelming for people. And we said that it's more difficult so that if you start pumping 2CB through the channels that you're distributing MDMA, you're going to have more negative reactions, you're going to have more emergency room, and it's going to be difficult. But I will say the first time I took 2CB, it was so great that I decided I would never take it again, just so I could remember that one experience. Now, of course I took it again. But it's a terrific drug, and it's good that you brought it up. But it will be a long time before it goes through the FDA system. So that's one of those other ones developed by Sasha Shulgin that I think is going to require legalization for it to be much more prominent or to ever be really used in therapy settings. But there's loads of good drugs out there.
Amen.
Hey, Rick.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's coming. Yeah. Well, one day, I'm not going to be a criminal. You're a hero to me.
Yes.
Oh, of course. Yeah, let's do it. For sure.
I didn't take it if you guys want. Is it flash on or?
Sure.
You might want to light it back there.
Got the
The lights on your face.
I mean, it's not, it's like 100 to 125 milligrams of MDA.
Yeah, you just have to get like
Well,
ransacked out
yeah,
of here.
you definitely need more medicine.
No, I know that. I was just curious.
It's not our fault. They just
Yeah,
like
100 to
got out.
100 would be 100, somewhere there for MD. It's a little bit stronger than MDMA with the heartbeat and blood pressure.
I've read about it.
Yeah, but it's worth it. I had to just say the most beautiful breakup with a girlfriend with MDA. because some adult lovers came into the picture, and we had to figure out if she should stay with me or go with him. And so we decided that she and I would take MDA together all night, sort it out, and it was just so beautiful. And we just had this. I felt like the stars became the foreground. We would say something, and nothing would happen for like half an hour while we sort of let it sink through.
It's funny, I actually just had a pretty good breakup quote like right after a visit. It was also like a fairly
Yeah, and in the morning we realized that she